The radio crackled with static as Colonel Marcus Brennan stared at the tactical display, his weathered face illuminated by the red glow of emergency lighting. 36 hours into Operation Steel Vanguard, everything had gone catastrophically wrong. The 82nd Airborne was pinned down in a valley that intelligence had sworn was clear. 3 Apache gunships lay twisted and burning in the Afghan dirt. The Taliban had somehow acquired surface-to-air missiles, Russian Iglas that turned the sky into a killing field. "Overlord, this is Chaos 6, came the desperate voice of Captain Rodriguez through the speakers. "We've got enemy armor moving in from 3 sides. My boys are down to their last magazines. Where's that close air support?" Brennan closed his eyes. He'd already lost 2 F-16s to the missile sites hidden in the ridgeline. The remaining aircraft were grounded, their pilots refusing what amounted to suicide missions. The rescue helicopters couldn't penetrate the defensive envelope. In 6 hours, when the sun set behind those jagged peaks, 400 American soldiers would be overrun and slaughtered. "Sir," his aide whispered, "there's something else." Brennan turned to see Lieutenant Harrison pointing at a single blip on the radar screen. Aircraft identifier Hog 7, approaching from the south at low altitude. The colonel's blood went cold. That was Captain Vera Tombstone Kozlowski's A-10 Thunderbolt II, the same pilot who'd been grounded 3 days ago for reckless conduct, after she'd buzzed a convoy of Afghan National Army vehicles that were supposedly friendlies, but had been feeding intelligence to the enemy. "Get me Kozlowski on the radio," Brennan barked. The comms officer shook his head. "She's not responding to any frequencies, sir. Radio's either dead or she's ignoring us." Through the bunker's reinforced windows, Brennan could see the distant smudge of smoke rising from the valley where his men were dying. The A-10, that ugly, beloved beast, was built for one purpose: to kill tanks and save infantry. But the missile sights would shred her aluminum skin before she could get within gun range. Even Kozlowski, with her legendary reputation for impossible rescues, couldn't thread that needle. "Sir," Harrison said quietly, "Colonel Mackenzie is on the line from CENTCOM. He wants to know if we should begin casualty notifications for the entire battalion." Brennan picked up the secure phone, his hand trembling slightly. In his 30 years of service, he'd never declared a unit lost before friendly fire could reach them. The words stuck in his throat like broken glass. Outside, that lone A-10 kept coming, a gray speck against the hostile sky, carrying either salvation or one more tragedy. Captain Vera Kozlowski checked her instruments one final time as she flew nap of the earth through the Hindu Kush Mountains. Her A-10's twin engines hummed with mechanical precision, the familiar vibration through her seat a comfort she'd known for 8 years and 247 combat missions. The radio chatter had been desperate for hours. Friendly forces surrounded, air support denied, rescue impossible. Standard protocol would be to wait for the missile sites to be neutralized. Standard protocol was about to get good men killed. She banked hard left around a razor-sharp ridge, her aircraft's shadow racing across the rocky terrain below. The Warthog wasn't built for stealth or speed. It was built to absorb punishment and deliver devastating firepower when everything else had failed. Today, that's exactly what was needed. The grounding order from 3 days ago still burned in her memory. She'd saved 30 Afghan civilians from what intelligence later confirmed was a Taliban execution squad, but the political fallout had been swift. Cowboy tactics, they'd called it. Insubordination. Her squadron commander, Major Patterson, had been sympathetic but firm. "Vera, you can't keep making decisions like you're fighting World War III. This is a political war now." But politics didn't matter when American soldiers were dying in a valley surrounded by enemy armor. She'd slipped away from Bagram Air Base during the morning chaos, filing a false flight plan for a routine patrol. By the time anyone realized what she'd done, she'd be either dead or vindicated. The GPS showed her position, 12 minutes out from the target area. Intel reports indicated at least 4 SA-24 Grinch missiles in the ridgeline, modern, deadly, and perfectly positioned to deny air support to the trapped battalion. The smart play would be to come in high and fast, drop her ordnance from maximum range, and pray for lucky hits. But smart wouldn't be enough today. Kozlowski adjusted her helmet and checked her ammunition counters. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon held 1,150 rounds of 30 depleted uranium shells, enough to turn any armored vehicle into scrap metal. Her external hardpoints carried 8 AGM-65 Maverick missiles and 4 Mark 82 bombs. It was a full combat load, but against prepared positions with air defenses, it might not be enough. She thought about her father, Colonel Victor Kozlowski, killed in action over Baghdad when she was 16. His last radio transmission had been simple: taking fire, going in hot. The official report said he died protecting a convoy of wounded Marines. The unofficial story, whispered among pilots, was that he'd deliberately drawn enemy fire away from a field hospital, trading his life for hundreds of others. Today felt like that kind of day. The Taliban commander known as White Wolf surveyed his defensive positions with cold satisfaction. 3 days of careful preparation had transformed this valley into a perfect killing ground. The American paratroopers, scattered across the rocky terrain below, were trapped like insects in amber. His fighters controlled every ridgeline, every approach, every possible escape route. "Commander," his second-in-command reported, "the missile teams report ready status. 4 Igla positions, overlapping fields of fire. No aircraft can survive passage through our defensive envelope." White Wolf nodded, his scarred face impassive behind wraparound sunglasses. He'd learned to fight Americans during the Soviet occupation, then refined those skills against NATO forces for 2 decades. The key was patience. Let them exhaust their ammunition, let desperation creep into their voices, then crush them when hope died. The radio intercepts had been illuminating. The American colonel, Brennan, according to their intelligence, was preparing to sacrifice his trapped battalion rather than lose more aircraft. A practical decision, but one that would hand the Taliban a propaganda victory worth more than 10 successful ambushes. "Sir," the radio operator called out, "we're detecting a single aircraft approaching from the south. Low altitude, subsonic. The signature matches an A-10 Thunderbolt." White Wolf smiled. The Americans called it the Warthog, an ugly, slow ground attack aircraft that had terrorized insurgent forces for decades. But ugly and slow also meant vulnerable to surface-to-air missiles. His missile teams had shot down faster, more maneuverable targets than this lumbering relic. "Alert all Igla teams," he commanded. "Target priority, the A-10. Let it approach within optimal engagement range, then destroy it where the Americans can watch. Make sure they understand that no rescue is coming." Through his binoculars, he could see the desperate fighting positions of the trapped paratroopers. They'd fought bravely for 36 hours, but courage couldn't overcome superior positioning and overwhelming firepower. The A-10 pilot, whoever they were, was flying into a carefully prepared execution. The mountains seemed to hold their breath as the distant growl of twin turbofans echoed off the peaks. White Wolf had orchestrated the deaths of 67 American aircraft over his career. This would be 68. But something felt different about this approach. The A-10 wasn't coming in high and fast like previous air support attempts. It was hugging the terrain, using the mountain ridges for cover, approaching from an unexpected vector. Either the pilot was inexperienced and making tactical errors, or they were more dangerous than the others. White Wolf keyed his radio. "All units maintain discipline. Wait for my command before engaging." Technical Sergeant Mike Diesel Robertson pressed himself against the boulder that had been his cover for the past 14 hours. His M4 carbine was down to 2 magazines, and the Taliban armor was close enough now that he could hear the diesel engines growling between the mortar explosions. The kid next to him, Private First Class Johnson from Detroit, was trying not to cry as he bandaged a shrapnel wound in his leg. "Sarge," Johnson whispered, "you think that air support's really coming?" Robertson had been in the Army for 15 years. He'd seen enough combat to know when a situation was hopeless, and enough bureaucracy to know when politics got soldiers killed. The radio chatter had stopped mentioning close air support 20 minutes ago. The brass was writing them off. "Just keep your head down, kid," he said, chambering a fresh round. "Regiment doesn't abandon its own." But even as he said it, Robertson could see the truth in the faces around him. Delta Company was scattered across a half-mile of broken terrain with no mutual support. The Taliban had spent days preparing this ambush, and they were executing it with methodical precision. When the sun set in 5 hours, the enemy would have night vision advantage, and the Americans would be slaughtered in the darkness. The radio in Robertson's patrol pack crackled with Lieutenant Martinez's voice. "All Chaos 6 elements, consolidate on my position. We're going to make a fighting withdrawal to the North Ridge." Robertson almost laughed. The North Ridge was 1,000 meters of open ground under direct observation by enemy spotters. It would be a turkey shoot. But Martinez was a good officer. If he was ordering a suicidal advance, it meant staying put was even worse. "Johnson, you stay with me," Robertson said, hauling the wounded soldier to his feet. "We're moving in 60 seconds. That's when they heard it, the distinctive growl of an A-10's twin engines, still distant but unmistakable. The sound that had saved countless infantry units from hopeless situations. Robertson felt something he hadn't experienced in hours: hope. "Holy shit, Sarge," Johnson breathed. "Is that—" "Hog inbound," Robertson confirmed, scanning the sky through his rifle scope. "Somebody's coming to the party." But even as relief flooded through the trapped soldiers, Robertson could see the missile contrails streaking up from the ridgelines. The Taliban had been waiting for this moment. 4 surface-to-air missiles traced bright paths against the afternoon sky, converging on the approaching aircraft with deadly precision. The A-10 pilot was flying straight into hell, and there was nothing the ground troops could do but watch. Captain Kozlowski saw the missile launches from 8 miles out, 4 bright streaks clawing upward through the thin mountain air. Her threat warning system screamed with electronic alerts as the SA-24 active seekers locked onto her aircraft's heat signature. Standard evasive procedures called for immediate defensive turns, chaff and flare deployment, and withdrawal to safe distance. Instead, she pushed the throttles forward and dove toward the valley floor. The first Igla passed overhead by mere feet, its proximity fuse failing to detonate. The second missile tracked her aggressive turn, but the A-10's surprisingly tight turning radius carried her outside its engagement envelope. The third weapon detonated in her chaff cloud, showering the aircraft with harmless aluminum strips. The fourth missile was the problem. Kozlowski felt the impact as a sharp metallic bang somewhere behind her left engine. Warning lights flooded her cockpit, hydraulic pressure dropping, electrical systems failing, fuel leak from the port wing tank. The Warthog shuddered but kept flying. She'd taken worse hits and made it home. "Unknown aircraft, this is Overlord Actual," Colonel Brennan's voice crackled through her headset. "You are ordered to abort and return to base immediately. The target area is too hot for single aircraft attack." She switched off her radio. The valley opened before her like a diorama of warfare. She could see muzzle flashes from the Taliban positions, the scattered defensive clusters of trapped American paratroopers, the burning wreckage of 3 Apache helicopters. Her targeting computer began cataloging threats: 2 BMP-2 infantry fighting vehicles, a T-55 tank, multiple mortar positions, and at least 30 fighters with RPGs and heavy machine guns. The enemy had made one critical mistake in their defensive planning. They'd positioned their armor in a narrow defile between 2 ridgelines, perfect for controlling the valley, but vulnerable to attack from directly above. The SA-24 sights were on the high ground, but their engagement envelopes had minimum altitude restrictions. If she could get low enough, fast enough, she could thread the needle. Kozlowski armed her weapons systems and began her attack run. The GAU-8 cannon spun up to firing speed with a mechanical whine that every ground soldier learned to love. 8 years of combat had taught her that the A-10's greatest weapon wasn't its armor or its firepower. It was the psychological effect of its distinctive sound. When friendly forces heard that cannon, they knew salvation was 30 seconds away. The Taliban fighters below were about to learn why American soldiers called her Tombstone. White Wolf watched the A-10 survive his missile ambush with professional admiration mixed with growing concern. 4 SA-24 Grinch missiles represented 6 months of careful acquisition through Pakistani arms dealers. That they'd failed to down a single aircraft, even one as heavily armored as the Warthog, suggested a pilot of exceptional skill or exceptional luck. All missile teams, reload and prepare for second engagement, he commanded into his radio. Target is damaged but still combat effective. The A-10 had disappeared behind the eastern ridgeline, using the terrain to mask its approach. White Wolf had seen this tactic before. American pilots called it nap of the earth flying, staying below radar coverage until the last possible moment. But his defensive positions commanded every approach to the valley. The aircraft would have to expose itself to deliver effective fires. Through his binoculars, he could see his armor commanders repositioning their vehicles for mutual support. The two BMP-2s moved to flanking positions, while the T-55 tank backed into a prepared hull-down position behind a rocky outcropping. His mortar teams continued their methodical bombardment of the trapped Americans, keeping them pinned while the armor closed for the final assault. "Commander," his radio operator reported, "we're detecting the aircraft on the northern approach. Speed 270 knots, altitude approximately 50 meters. Time to target area, 90 seconds. White Wolf smiled grimly. The pilot had chosen the most predictable attack vector, a classic gun run down the valley's central axis. His heavy machine gun teams were already traversing their weapons to create an overlapping wall of fire. Even the legendary A-10 couldn't survive sustained hits from 12.7 armor-piercing rounds at close range. "All units, weapons free when target enters the kill zone," he transmitted. "Remember, we want this aircraft to burn where the Americans can see it." The psychological warfare aspect was crucial. Breaking the enemy's hope was often more valuable than destroying their equipment. When that A-10 crashed in flames before their eyes, the trapped paratroopers would understand that no rescue was coming. Demoralization would set in, followed by surrender or death. But something nagged at White Wolf's tactical instincts. The aircraft's approach seemed almost deliberate in its predictability. Either the pilot was making amateur mistakes under pressure, or they were setting up something unexpected. In 30 years of warfare, he'd learned to trust those instincts. "Second missile team," he added to his radio transmission, "prepare for emergency engagement. If the aircraft deviates from expected approach, you have authorization to fire immediately." The mountains echoed with the growing roar of twin turbofan engines. Whatever happened in the next 60 seconds would determine the fate of 400 American soldiers. Sergeant Robertson heard the A-10 before he saw it, that distinctive rumble of General Electric TF-34 engines that meant close air support was inbound. But the sound was different this time, more labored, with an irregular rhythm that suggested battle damage. The pilot had taken hits from the missile barrage but was still coming. "All Chaos 6 elements, mark your positions with smoke," Lieutenant Martinez's voice crackled over the radio. "Danger close air support inbound." Robertson pulled a purple smoke grenade from his gear and tossed it into the open ground 20 meters from his position. Across the valley, other purple plumes began rising from the scattered defensive positions, creating a rough perimeter that defined friendly forces. Any ordnance delivered outside that perimeter would be considered enemy targets. The Taliban mortar fire intensified, as if the enemy commanders understood that the next few minutes would be decisive. Explosions walked closer to Robertson's position, forcing him to press himself deeper into the rocky cover. Private Johnson was unconscious now, blood loss and shock taking their toll. "Sarge," Corporal Williams called from the next position, "I got eyes on the hog, 2 o'clock high." Robertson followed Williams' pointing finger and spotted emerging from behind the eastern ridge. The aircraft was lower than any ground attack run he'd ever witnessed, maybe 50 feet above the valley floor, close enough to see the pilot's helmet through the cockpit canopy. Dark smoke trailed from the left engine, and he could make out impact damage on the port wing. The Warthog was flying straight down the valley's central axis, directly into the most heavily defended section of the Taliban position. It was either the most suicidal attack run Robertson had ever seen, or the most brilliant. "Jesus Christ," Williams breathed, "she's going in alone." The Taliban heavy weapons opened fire simultaneously. Machine guns, RPGs, small arms, everything they had. Tracers streaked toward the approaching aircraft like deadly fireworks. Robertson could see the pilot through his rifle scope now, calm and focused behind the reflective visor, hands steady on the controls despite flying through a hurricane of enemy fire. That's when he realized something that made his blood run cold. The purple smoke markers weren't just identifying friendly positions. They were creating a perfect corridor for the A-10's gun run. The pilot was using their smoke as navigation beacons, flying between the friendly positions at an altitude that would put her cannon fire danger close to both sides. "Get down," Robertson screamed to anyone who could hear him. "Everybody get down." The GAU-8 cannon began firing with its characteristic buzzsaw roar. Kozlowski lined up her gun run with mechanical precision. The GAU-8's targeting pipper centered on the lead BMP-2 infantry fighting vehicle. At 200 meters altitude and 270 knots airspeed, she had perhaps 3 seconds of firing time before she'd have to pull up to avoid controlled flight into terrain. 3 seconds to destroy enough enemy armor to give the trapped paratroopers a fighting chance. The purple smoke markers rising from friendly positions created a perfect corridor for her attack. She'd flown similar missions in Iraq, threading 30 cannon fire between friendly and enemy forces separated by less than 100 meters. The key was absolute precision and complete trust in both the aircraft systems and the ground troops' discipline. Enemy tracers filled the air around her cockpit. The A-10's titanium bathtub armor could withstand direct hits from 23 cannon rounds, but concentrated small arms fire could still find vulnerable components. She felt impacts against the fuselage, sharp metallic bangs that meant holes in her aircraft's skin, but the flight controls remained responsive. "Guns, guns, guns," she transmitted on the emergency frequency, following proper attack procedures despite flying without ground control authorization. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon unleashed its devastating firepower at 3,900 rounds per minute. Each 30 depleted uranium shell weighed nearly 2 pounds and could penetrate the armor of any main battle tank. Against the BMP-2's aluminum hull, the effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The first infantry fighting vehicle simply disintegrated under the cannon's impact. The second BMP tried to reverse into cover, but caught a sustained burst through its engine compartment. Flames erupted from both vehicles as their ammunition stores detonated in secondary explosions. Kozlowski pulled hard on the stick, climbing vertically to avoid the ridgeline ahead. G-forces pressed her into her ejection seat as the damaged A-10 clawed for altitude. The threat warning system had gone silent. Either the remaining missile sites were reloading, or her low-altitude approach had taken them by surprise. Banking left for her second attack run, she could see the effect of her first pass. The Taliban armor was in disarray, crews abandoning damaged vehicles and running for cover. The trapped American paratroopers were already moving, advancing from their defensive positions to exploit the tactical advantage. But the T-55 tank remained intact, and its main gun was traversing toward her aircraft. At this range, even a glancing hit from a 100 Michel would be fatal. White Wolf stared at the burning wreckage of his two BMP-2s with a mixture of rage and grudging respect. The A-10 pilot had executed a perfect gun run, threading cannon fire between friendly and enemy positions with surgical precision. In 30 years of warfare, he'd rarely seen such skill combined with such audacity. "All units concentrate fire on the aircraft," he barked into his radio. "Bring it down before it can make another pass." The American ground forces were already exploiting the tactical opening. Purple smoke gave way to assault formations as the paratroopers advanced on his disrupted positions. Without the BMP-2s providing fire support, his infantry would be overwhelmed within minutes. "Tank Commander," he called to the T-55's crew, "target the aircraft on its next approach. High explosive proximity fuse. Damage the aircraft enough to force it off station." The tank's commander acknowledged the order. The ancient T-55 might be obsolete against modern armor, but its 100 main gun could still swat aircraft from the sky if the crew was skilled enough. White Wolf had chosen this particular tank commander for exactly that reason. Sergeant Malik had been trained by Soviet instructors in anti-aircraft gunnery. The A-10 reappeared from behind the western ridge, approaching for a second attack run. This time the pilot was coming in from a different angle, making the approach more difficult to predict. White Wolf could see battle damage on the aircraft, torn metal panels, streaming hydraulic fluid, smoke from the left engine, but the Warthog kept flying. "Missile teams fire when ready," he commanded. Two more SA-24 Grinch missiles streaked upward from concealed positions. The A-10 pilot deployed chaff and flares while executing a violent evasive maneuver, but the missile's proximity fuses activated simultaneously. White Wolf saw the double explosion bracket the aircraft, saw metal fragments pepper the fuselage, saw the left engine burst into flames. But still the A-10 kept coming. The tank's main gun fired with a thunderous boom that echoed off the valley walls. The 100 Michel exploded 50 meters in front of the aircraft, filling the air with deadly shrapnel. White Wolf was certain no pilot could survive such concentrated defensive fire. Then he heard the sound that had haunted his nightmares for 2 decades. The buzz-saw roar of the GAU-8 cannon, aimed directly at his command position. The proximity explosions from the SA-24s had shredded Kozlowski's left engine and damaged her hydraulic systems beyond repair. Warning lights painted her cockpit red as system after system failed. But the A-10 was designed to absorb punishment that would destroy any other aircraft. She still had manual flight controls, and the GAU-8 cannon remained operational. The T-55 tank's main gun blast had been close enough to crack her canopy and pepper the fuselage with shrapnel, but the titanium armor around her cockpit held. She lined up for her second gun run, targeting the tank that posed the greatest threat to the advancing American infantry. "Mayday, Mayday," she transmitted on guard frequency. "Hawk 7 is taking heavy fire and losing altitude. Single ship attack on grid 41 SMB 12,345 67,890. Danger close to friendly forces." The T-55 was backing into a hull-down position behind rocky cover, presenting only its turret and main gun. A difficult target under the best circumstances, nearly impossible with her aircraft's damaged flight controls. But the tank had to be neutralized before it could massacre the advancing paratroopers. Kozlowski centered the targeting pipper and squeezed the trigger. The GAU-8 fired its second sustained burst, 30 depleted uranium shells tracing a deadly path toward the Soviet-era tank. Most of the rounds impacted harmlessly against the rocky terrain, but 6 shells found their mark. The T-55's turret armor might stop infantry weapons, but it was never designed to resist 13 cannon fire. The depleted uranium penetrators punched through the steel plating like paper, detonating the tank's ammunition in a spectacular explosion that sent the turret flying 30 meters through the air. But her attack run had carried her too low and too slow. Small arms fire from the remaining Taliban positions concentrated on her damaged aircraft. She felt impacts throughout the fuselage, dozens of rifle rounds and machine gun bullets finding their mark. The right engine began losing power, and she could smell smoke filling the cockpit. The A-10 was dying around her, but she'd accomplished her mission. The enemy armor was destroyed, and the American ground forces were advancing. In 60 seconds, they'd overrun the Taliban positions and establish fire superiority. Kozlowski fought the failing aircraft toward the relative safety of the southern ridge, but she knew she wasn't going to make it. The controls were becoming unresponsive, and she could see fuel streaming from ruptured wing tanks. Time for the decision every combat pilot hoped they'd never face. She reached for the ejection seat handles. Lieutenant Martinez led the assault across the valley floor, his M4 carbine chattering on full automatic as he bounded between cover positions. The A-10's devastating attack runs had shattered the Taliban defensive line, but enemy fighters still controlled sections of the high ground. The next few minutes would determine whether Delta Company could exploit their tactical advantage or be pinned down again. "First squad, take the ridgeline," he shouted over the din of gunfire. "Second squad, secure the mortar positions. Third squad with me on the enemy command post." The paratroopers advanced with textbook precision, using fire and movement tactics to overwhelm the disorganized Taliban fighters. Without their armor support, and with their command structure disrupted, the enemy was retreating in small groups rather than maintaining coordinated resistance. But Martinez could see the A-10 was in serious trouble. The aircraft was trailing flame and smoke from both engines, flying barely 50 feet above the rocky terrain. As he watched, the Warthog shuddered and began losing altitude, clearly fighting a losing battle against battle damage and mechanical failure. "All Chaos 6 elements, be advised friendly aircraft is in distress," he transmitted. "Prepare to mark crash site and establish security perimeter for rescue operations." The irony wasn't lost on him. The pilot who'd risked everything to save his battalion was now the one who needed rescuing. Martinez had been in the army long enough to know that debt of honor worked both ways. If that A-10 went down, his soldiers would move heaven and earth to get the pilot home. Sergeant Robertson's voice crackled over the radio. "Sir, I got eyes on the bird. She's trying to clear the southern ridge but losing altitude fast. Recommend we push hard to secure a landing zone." Martinez could see it too, the struggling to gain precious feet of altitude, the pilot fighting to reach friendly territory before the aircraft became unflyable. But the southern ridge was still under partial Taliban control, and the enemy would be converging on any crash site. "All units, advance by bounds to grid 41 SMB 12,350 67,950, he ordered. "We're going to give our pilot somewhere safe to put down." The race was on, Martinez's paratroopers sprinting across broken terrain to secure a landing zone, while overhead the dying A-10 fought physics and enemy fire for every second of flight time. In the military, you never left anyone behind, especially someone who just saved your life. The distinctive sound of the A-10's engines was growing more labored with each passing second. Colonel Brennan watched the tactical display with a mixture of professional admiration and personal anguish. Captain Kozlowski's unauthorized attack had accomplished the impossible, breaking the Taliban siege and giving his trapped battalion a fighting chance. But her A-10 was clearly dying, streaming smoke and losing altitude with each passing moment. "Sir," Lieutenant Harrison reported, "we have positive radio contact with Chaos 6 Actual. Lieutenant Martinez reports enemy resistance collapsing and friendly forces advancing to secure the crash site." Brennan nodded grimly. The tactical situation was improving rapidly, but they were about to lose one of their most experienced combat pilots. Kozlowski had disobeyed direct orders, risked court-martial, and probably sacrificed her life to save 400 soldiers she'd never met. It was the kind of decision that made careers or ended them. "Get me CASEVAC on the radio," he ordered. "I want a full medical team standing by at Bagram, and contact the Air Rescue Service. We may need a combat search and rescue mission if that bird goes down in hostile territory." The communications officer acknowledged the orders while Brennan continued monitoring the tactical displays. Intelligence reports indicated Taliban reinforcements moving toward the valley from 3 directions. The window of opportunity was narrow. They had perhaps 30 minutes to extract the ground forces and any downed aircrew before enemy reserves arrived in strength. "Sir," his aide whispered, "there's something else. I just received a priority message from CENTCOM. General Morrison wants to know if Captain Kozlowski should face disciplinary action for violating the grounding order." Brennan almost laughed at the absurdity of military bureaucracy. A pilot was about to crash in enemy territory after single-handedly saving an entire battalion, and the Pentagon was worried about paperwork violations. Sometimes he wondered if the staff officers had ever heard a shot fired in anger. "Tell General Morrison that Captain Kozlowski is currently engaged in combat operations under my direct authorization," Brennan said carefully. "Any administrative matters can be addressed after the tactical situation is resolved." It wasn't strictly true, but it wasn't strictly false either. As the ground commander, Brennan had the authority to modify mission parameters based on changing tactical requirements. If anyone wanted to court-martial Kozlowski for saving American lives, they'd have to go through him first. On the display screen, the A-10's transponder signal was growing weaker. The ejection decision was taken out of Kozlowski's hands when the right engine finally seized completely, sending violent vibrations through the airframe that made controlled flight impossible. She could see the southern ridge ahead, maybe 2 miles of broken terrain that might as well have been 200. The A-10 was settling toward the valley floor like a wounded bird, trading airspeed for altitude in a losing bargain with gravity. "Mayday, Mayday, Hog 7 going down," she transmitted on guard frequency. "Grid 41 SMB 12,355 67,945, estimate 30 seconds to impact. Pilot will attempt controlled landing." She'd practiced forced landings dozens of times in simulators, but never in an aircraft shot full of holes over enemy territory. The key was finding relatively flat terrain while maintaining just enough airspeed to keep the wings flying. Too slow and she'd stall into an unrecoverable spin. Too fast and the impact would kill her even if she survived the crash. The landing gear was damaged beyond use, so it would have to be a belly landing. Kozlowski configured the aircraft for emergency landing: gear up, flaps up, engine switches off, fuel switches off. The checklist was burned into her memory from hundreds of hours of emergency procedures training. Below her, she could see American paratroopers advancing across the valley floor, having overrun most of the Taliban positions. Purple smoke began rising from a flat section of terrain near the southern ridge, her rescuers marking an improvised landing zone. The sight of friendly forces gave her hope that she might survive the next 60 seconds. The ground rushed up with frightening speed. Kozlowski pulled back on the stick to flare the aircraft, bleeding off airspeed in exchange for a gentler touchdown angle. The A-10's belly scraped against rocky terrain with a grinding shriek of tortured aluminum. She felt the aircraft bouncing, sliding, cartwheeling across the desert floor in a cloud of dust and debris. The impact drove her forward against the restraint harness with bone-jarring force. Warning lights flashed, alarms screamed, and then everything went silent except for the hiss of escaping hydraulic fluid and the crackle of electrical fires. Kozlowski was alive, conscious, and trapped in a burning aircraft 300 meters from the nearest friendly forces. Through her cracked visor, she could see Taliban fighters emerging from concealed positions, racing toward the crash site with obvious hostile intent. Time to see if her rescue training was as good as her flying skills. Sergeant Robertson sprinted toward the crashed A-10 with his rifle at the ready, Private Johnson's blood still drying on his uniform. The Warthog had carved a quarter-mile furrow through the rocky terrain before coming to rest upside down against a boulder outcropping. Smoke poured from the wreckage, and he could see the distinctive orange glow of fuel fires beginning to spread. "Chaos 6-2, this is Chaos 6-7, he transmitted while running. "I have eyes on the crash site. Aircraft is inverted and burning. No sign of pilot movement." Behind him, Lieutenant Martinez was coordinating the rescue effort while maintaining suppressive fire on the remaining Taliban positions. The enemy was converging on the crash site from multiple directions, apparently hoping to capture the pilot before American forces could intervene. Robertson reached the inverted cockpit to find Captain Kozlowski hanging upside down in her restraint harness, semi-conscious but alive. Blood trickled from cuts on her face where the shattered canopy had sprayed her with glass fragments, but she was trying to work her way out of the ejection seat. "Ma'am, don't move," Robertson ordered, slinging his rifle to free his hands. "Let me get you out of there." The canopy emergency release was jammed, probably damaged in the crash. Robertson pulled out his multi-tool and began working on the canopy latches while Kozlowski fought to remain conscious. The fuel fires were spreading, and the aircraft's ammunition could cook off at any moment. "Sergeant," Kozlowski mumbled through her oxygen mask, "my flight suit's caught on something. Can't get free." Robertson could see the problem. Torn metal from the damaged cockpit had snagged her survival vest. The fabric was tough enough to resist tearing, but too tight to slip over her shoulders. He'd have to cut her loose, and that meant precious seconds they might not have. "Chaos 6-7, this is Chaos 6 actual," Lieutenant Martinez's voice crackled in his earpiece. "What's your status? We got enemy movement closing on your position." "Pilot's alive but trapped," Robertson reported while sawing through the vest straps with his knife. "Need 2 more minutes to extract her." The sound of approaching gunfire suggested they didn't have 2 minutes. Kozlowski grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "Sergeant, in my left pocket, data card with targeting information. Get it to intelligence even if."